Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. This is honestly probably one of my most requested videos. You know, I've done my Stephen King collection video. I'm in the middle of the King Chronicles, but one thing that I've never really talked about or really made a list of is my favorite King books. So I figured since it's spooky season, let's go ahead and talk about that. Full disclosure, I really only read roughly half of Stephen King's body of work. So there are probably going to be a lot of books that won't make it into this list that you guys are going to be like, what the fuck? You know, why didn't she talk about Needful Things or Misery or, you know, other things like that, other well-known books? That would be because I haven't read them. If your fave doesn't make it into this list, so sorry. These are my personal preferences. I also do want to say that I'm going to be talking about these books and I'm not going to be talking about them in any particular order. I find it really hard to rank them, so I'm just going to be talking about 10 of my favorite Stephen King books today. So the first thing that I actually want to do is talk about some short story collections. I did decide to include short story collections on this because I love short stories, and I particularly love King short stories as well. The first short story collection that I'm going to talk about, if you guys couldn't have already guessed, is definitely going to be Night Shift. This was his first collection that he released, and I just feel like it's a really good example of what his body of work is. There are a lot of stories in this particular collection that really have stayed with me. Strawberry Spring is one of them. The Boogeyman in particular, that's one of my favorite short stories ever that he's written, whatever. You know, this has Children of the Corn and a bunch of other classics as well. So it's just one that I really enjoy. So that's why it's in this list. All right, so this next one is another collection, and I feel like I'm gonna catch heat for this, mostly because a lot of people say that it's not really good. However, I do want to point out that the reason that this is on my list is because it is very nostalgic to me. It is one of the first books that I can remember going out and buying of his. You know, the one that I have in my hand is a first edition, and I have read it so many times. I also, whenever I was in 8th grade, I believe, we had the opportunity to choose a short story and basically teach the literary elements that appear in that story. And so I chose one out of this collection. This is Everything's Eventual, 14 Dark Tales. There are definitely some hits and definitely some misses in this particular story. Some of my favorites that appear in this one are The Man in the Black Suit. That's the one that I taught whenever I was in 8th grade. Everything's Eventual, I already mentioned. The Road Virus Heads North. That's actually one of my favorite short stories of all time. I really love it. It's one of those that's really stuck with me. 1408 does appear in this one as well as Riding the Bullet. So there's a lot of well-known stories in this one. But again, I think the reason that it sticks out as a favorite of mine is definitely, you know, a nostalgia factor. So next we're going to be talking about The Dead Zone. I really loved this book. Most of you guys know that I am a huge fan of character-driven stories, things that aren't necessarily plot-driven, things with a lot of character development and things that have a really slow burn quality to them. And that's one of the reasons that I do enjoy this book so much. Johnny himself is a really sympathetic character, I think, as a whole, because of those things. I think that this is one of King's most intricately plotted books, especially in his earlier work, as well as, you know, just one of the stories that I feel like he does the best in terms of character development. And so I just really, really loved this book. And I also love the general idea that surrounds this, you know, the Wheel of Fortune and can we actually escape our fate and questions like that. So next I'm going to talk about Carrie. And I see a lot of things about this book that it's really overrated. I think that if you're new to King, this is a good place to start. It is his first published work, but I think that it really gives you an idea of the kind of writer he is. I also just really enjoy the way that this story was set up because it goes back and forth between what is actually happening with the characters, and then it goes to interviews and newspaper clippings and things like that of the aftermath. And so it's always pushing the story along in that way. And it really builds this feeling of dread as you're going through those mediums, going back and forth. I enjoyed the characters. There are obviously some issues that I have with this book, but for the most part, I definitely call it one of my favorites of his. Next, we are going to talk about The Green Mile. So most people know this one because it is a film with many actors whose names I can't remember aside from Tom Hanks. And I actually saw the film a long time before I read the book. And the film is excellent. I think that to me is one of the best book to film adaptations that I have ever seen. Not just in talking about King's work in general, but just overall. Book to film adaptations, definitely one of the best that I've ever seen. But this book as a whole is so good. Again, we have something that doesn't really fit into the horror genre. There's so much more than that. It was actually published as a serial novel, I think in 5 or 6 different parts. I have the bound up edition, obviously, but this is a book that I remember making me cry like a baby. I would say that on my journey through rereading, you know, and reading his body of work, this is one that I am most excited to go back and reread. It has been many years since I've read it, but I know for a fact that this is absolutely one of my favorites. So good. If you have seen the movie and haven't read the book, I really encourage you to actually read the book. It's so good. Next, we're going to talk about Doomakey. This is a book that I feel like is so underrated. I know a few people who also count this among their favorites, but I don't see very many people talking about it. Again, this is a book that is not really horror, but there's a lot of emotional elements to it, and I love that about it. This book is one that I picked up right when I first started getting back into reading, right in my first couple of years of college, so think like 2008, which is actually when this book came out. And because I had not been reading for so long, when this book came out, I didn't really hear a lot about it. And I remember reading it and it's really thick, but it reads really quickly. This is another book that I remember very vividly. There are certain scenes in this book that I remember very vividly. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I count it among my favorites. The Stand is going to be next up on this list. However, it's like buried all the way down here, and that is just so much effort to pull that book out. So sorry, Booktube, I just really don't want to destroy my shelves for that. I feel like The Stand is counted among a lot of people's favorites. I think it seems to be polarizing. People either really love it or they really hate it. I personally am one of the people that really loves it. I love the good versus evil dynamic. I love the cast of characters. Yeah, I'm sure that there are probably parts of it that could have been chopped down, especially since I have read the complete and uncut edition multiple times. However, I think the story as a whole is just really good. You know, there are obviously things that I don't like about it. I love the fact that it's not really a horror, but it's more of a dystopian, and I love the fact that it's based in reality. You know, when you think about Captain Trips and like a government developed bio warfare weapon, you know, and what if that escaped to the public, what would happen? You know, when you think about that, that is so not outside of the realm of possibility. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I enjoy it so much, is because I really love things that have a grain of truth to them, that, you know, have an element of possibility. It's easier to suspend my disbelief if I feel like it is something that could in fact actually happen. And so I think that's one of the reasons that I love that story so much. Next is another book that I feel like would probably get flack from people, but that's 11/22/63. I read this for the first time, I can't remember exactly when I read it. It's been a year or two. But once again, we have a story that is, this story has a lot of science fiction elements to it. So this is very much like, what would happen if we could go back in time and change whether or not JFK was assassinated? What would happen, right? Questions that had been asked in the Dead Zone, kind of, whenever we talk about what if you could go back in time and kill Hitler, that type of thing. You know, how would we change the future? I really love that thought and that thought process, and, you know, really going through and, you know, if you were given the opportunity to do that, how would that play out? What would that look like? What would the consequences be? But the other thing that I love so much about this is it is very long. Again, it's very long. A lot of people have complaints about that. I enjoyed it, again, because I loved the characters. We know that I love character-driven books, and this is definitely character-driven. Whenever we talk about Sadie and whatever the fuck his name is, why can't I remember his name? Jake. I'm so bad at names. Jake and Sadie and their romance, and I loved that. And as I was going through and reading this book originally, I didn't realize just how invested I was in their story and in their characters until I got to the end and things really started happening, and then it was like, oh my god, like I have feelings about this. And I love stories that sneak up on me like that, and I think that's one of the reasons that I count this on my favorites. And this is another one that I'm probably gonna catch some flack for, and I don't really care. And it is actually The Outsider. So this was published in 2018. So this is one of his more recent works. I went into this very afraid, especially because of how much I did not like Sleeping Beauties, which was the one that was published prior to this, and then of course we have Elevation that was published after this, and that's a whole other thing. But I so enjoyed this story. I enjoyed it so much more than I thought that I was going to. One of the things that I really love about this is it reads a lot like an X-Files episode, and I am here for that kind of shit. You know, there were moments in this book that the way that he wrote and the way that the scenes played out, it just like, you know, you're reading it and your heart is racing because you're like, oh my gosh, what's about to happen? And then there was another moment within this book that I remember actually exclaiming, going, oh my God, or what, or something. But I remember exclaiming out loud because I was so into you know, the story and what was happening and how everything played out. Once again, this is not a true horror novel. And I think that's one of the things that appeals to me so much about King, is the fact that he does write so much more than horror. And as a horror author, I feel like he is overrated. So I love the fact that I can go through and have an author that has such a wide variety of work to choose from books with science fiction elements much like this and 11/22/63, things like that, to the true horror, which is the last book that we'll discuss. So of course, that being the last book that we're going to discuss is Salem's Lot. Those of you that know me personally know that this is my all-time favorite Stephen King book. I've probably read this 4 or 5 times, if I'm being honest, and sure, it has some problems, this being his second published work. However, I do love the slow burn quality to it. Again, I've talked about this several times already. Slow burns are my favorite. And then there's not really a lot of character development through this. I do think that that is one of the failings of this book, is the characters themselves, like Ben Mears and Susan. There is a lot of like a one-dimensional quality to them. However, when we talk about the town itself of Salem's Lot, I think that that is one of the most effective characters, so to speak, that King has ever written. When we talk about the inner workings of the town and, you know, the secrets that kind of everybody harbors, and it's those secrets that really allow, you know, evil to kind of like seep in to this town, and I just loved that. Not to mention, you know, it's spooky, it's vampires, it's really, I love this book. It's definitely my all-time favorite for sure. So while nothing else is in order, I can safely say that this is my favorite King book of all time. So that's it. That is what I have for you guys today. Comment down below and let me know what you think of the books that I have chosen. Don't come after me again because your book isn't on this list. I might not have read it yet. I feel like as I go through and continue to read his work, this list is going to change drastically. And then there's obviously books that I have read that haven't made it onto this list. As an example, The Shining. I feel like those two pop up again and again in favorites videos, and while I do very much enjoy them, I just happen to enjoy most of these a little bit more. So I wanted to limit myself to 10, or otherwise we would be here all day. I also chose to not include any of the books from the Dark Tower series because that is a whole other thing in and of itself. I do love that series. That's my favorite adult series of all time. So those are some of my favorite Stephen King books. Like I said, comment down below and let me know what your favorite is. Do you have a favorite that isn't on this list? Tell me about it in the comments below. You can also contact me on Twitter, Goodreads, or Instagram. All of my social media links can be found in the down bar below. As always, if you like what you see and you want to see more, make sure you click thumbs up and hit subscribe if you haven't already. You can also hit the bell to be notified whenever I upload. Expect to see a lot more things like this, recommendations, especially in terms of horror, if you're new here. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.